Really?
Resident Evil 3 Remake is both a fun and a frustrating game. It's a decent dose of action horror with good graphics and great characters, but it's also constantly a letdown as it fails to capitalize on its potential time and time again. Coming out just over a year after the remake of Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3 Remake tried to reinvent and update the original Resident Evil 3 in the same way that Resident Evil 2 Remake did for the original Resident Evil 2. In many ways, this modern take on RE3 is a great upgrade for players who can't quite gel with the tank controls and fixed camera angles of the original. It's a ground-up remake built in the impressive RE engine, with an over-the-shoulder perspective and new writing, character designs, environments, and level structure. But in other ways, it's a step down from the horror, tension, and expert level design of RE2R. My goal in this video is to illustrate the potential that this game had, and to explain why I found most of its elements to be disappointing. The first thing that I'd like to address is the common criticism that the game is too short. When I play through this game, I feel like it ends too quickly and that there's content missing. That's a sentiment felt by many players, and the most repeated counter I've heard is that Resident Evil 2 Remake takes about the same amount of time to complete, but no one complains about that game being too short. It takes me about 4.5 hours to complete 3 Remake, and it also takes me about 4.5 hours to complete 2 Remake. Yet, I agree with the common criticism that 3 Remake is much too short, and I don't feel that way about 2 Remake. How is that? The problem with the rebuttal of 2 is just as short, so 3 isn't too short, isn't just that these are two different games and this is a strong example of whataboutism, but that 3R feeling too short is indicative that this game is incomplete, whereas 2R felt like a well-rounded experience with no missing chunks. Now, as any fan of the original RE3 knows, there was, in fact, much content totally cut from the remake, such as the clock tower, Jill at the RPD, branching paths, boss fights, and more. But that's not the problem. The problem is that you can see where the developers are cutting corners, such as when the clock tower is clearly teased by prominently showing it here, and teased again with a conspicuously placed brochure on this park bench. Or when Nemesis appears here and you only get to interact with him with QTEs. Or how Nemesis evolves from this form to this form in seconds. It constantly feels like there should be large sections of gameplay here, whole levels to explore, but we don't get them. Confession. I've never actually played the original Resident Evil 3, but you don't need to have played the original to tell that there are areas in this game that were not fully fleshed out. Because even to me, someone completely new to this story, it felt like there was something missing from this game when I first played it. It only became clear what that was when I read reviews and saw videos from fans. It really helped me understand why I felt like this game was so oddly paced. At its core, the survival horror Resident Evil games are Metroidvanias. You should be exploring and backtracking through complexly woven areas. Learning to navigate the best RE levels efficiently is such a large part of the fun after all. Having a big section of Raccoon City that's falling to ruin is a great setting to explore for a Metroidvania. Before this game was released, all I could do was imagine the alleyways, buildings, streets, and parks there'd be for me to get lost in, all of them interconnected and filled with zombies as Nemesis hunted me down. But sadly, that's not really the case. Every level in the game is small and has a painfully linear design. This is especially disappointing when you're exploring Raccoon City. The Raccoon City section has a very simple layout. There are really only a couple of streets and a few rooms to explore. Not once did I get lost, not once did I have to stop and think about the route I was going to take, not once did I need to think critically about what items I would need to bring with me, and not once was I surprised by clever level design that loop in on itself. Objectives are clearly laid out for you and the path to them is very straightforward. I can't help but imagine a version of Raccoon City in this game that's large and maze-like, with Nemesis putting the kind of pressure on me that Mr. X did in 2 Remake to plan my paths well and prepare my inventory tactfully. Interactions with Nemi in this game are front-loaded and are mostly in the city level. You face him in several scripted set pieces, one of them being entirely on rails, and there are a couple boss fights with him while you're in the city. Outside of the city though, you only ever face him in boss fights or in a QTE segment where all you have to do is hold up. This is the worst part of the entire game as far as I'm concerned. I understand having a lot of his interactions being scripted. You want him to be on your ass at certain times for pacing and narrative reasons, but if you had big exploratory levels and a nemesis that would follow you throughout those levels, that could lead to the kind of emergent gameplay that would make every playthrough unique and more memorable. As it is now, you're going to face Nemesis in the exact same way on every playthrough. How great could it have been if you never knew when he was going to show up? On one playthrough, you could solve a puzzle with little hassle, but on another, he could show up before you enter that puzzle room, making you face the decision to try and lose him or to expend some precious resources to down him. Every time playing this game would be different from the last. There would be constant tension that he could be just around the corner. You'd have to listen for his footsteps as you navigated the city, taking advantage of the great sound design like RE2R did. It's just a massive disappointment that they didn't design the game this way. It's strange that most of your interactions with Nemesis are in the city, which is the first major level of the game. I don't understand why he didn't show up in the sewer or the lab or the hospital. I think having downtime between your encounters with him is a good idea. You need the slower quiet moments to make the high stress situations feel more impactful. The lows are what define the highs. But having Nemi on your ass so aggressively in the beginning, only to have him essentially disappear from the game except for the occasional boss fight until the end credits, makes RE3R a pacing disaster. I love the idea of Nemesis evolving over time. He starts out as just a tall and bulky figure who chases you. Then he gains new tools to try and kill you with, such as a rocket launcher and a flamethrower. Then he forms into Dog Nemi, something I've seen a lot of people online say resembles something not out of Resident Evil, but out of Bloodborne. Then the last time you encounter him, he's this gigantic monstrosity that's 2 stories tall and 2 stories wide. It's comical. My issue isn't that he evolves from 1 to 100. My issue is that he starts at 1, goes to 2, 3, then 50, and then 100. His transitions from form to form take such large leaps that my suspension of disbelief is shattered. I'm no longer intimidated by what Nemesis is going to be capable of the next time I see him. I'm laughing at what he has become. I mentioned before that RE3R's level design was too linear. Linearity is not a bad thing inherently. In fact, action games often benefit from linearity because it's easier to craft and balance enemy encounters. It's fair to say that RE3 is a more action-oriented survival horror game than RE1 and 2. The scale of the narrative is much bigger than its predecessors. You don't spend most of your time in a mansion like in 1 or a police station like in 2, but this time you're exploring a whole city with zombies pouring into the streets and Nemesis on your tail. It makes sense then to narrow the focus of the gameplay to running and shooting and focus less on things like inventory management and puzzle solving. Resident Evil 4 did that, and hey, that's a great game. That's one of the greatest shooters ever made. Obviously there's a large but coming, so here it is. RE3R isn't a good shooter. Now, the shooting mechanics themselves are not what I take issue with, except for maybe that headshots aren't as effective as they should be. My issue is that 3R employs a combat system that was designed for the slow-paced, tense horror of 2R. Resident Evil 2 Remake was a truly classic survival horror game, by which I mean it was a horror game that focused on atmosphere, tension, and resource/inventory management. The shooting in that game wasn't meant to create a deep combat system, it was meant to be a pillar to prop up the survivalist aspects of 2R. You were trying to survive in a zombie-infested RPD, and shooting was your one way to defend yourself, but there aren't enough bullets to kill everything, so you have to calculate every shot and pray to God that you'd never miss. And most of the time, you try to land just a single shot to stun the enemy and run around it. It was a brilliantly balanced mechanic that constantly made you second guess if you should fill your limited inventory with more ammo or more healing items, all while having the space for the relevant key items you need to progress. You have a pistol for the weak enemies and a shotgun for the beefier ones in the hairy situations. There are a lot of exceptions to that, but that's mostly what you'll be using. And if a zombie grabs you, you have defense items that can save you from damage, such as the combat knife and a grenade, but they're a limited resource that you must manage carefully. It was a very simple combat system that was less about shooting the shot and more about the decision of shooting the shot. In RE2R, most enemy encounters were with 1 to 2 zombies, and sometimes the game would get really crazy and pit you against 4 to 5 zombies. The limited combat system was tuned perfectly to make these encounters tense, and every additional zombie would drastically lower your chances of surviving. But you will find yourself against hordes of zombies very often in RE3R. I'm not trying to say that you're not given the ability to face hordes in this game. 3R gives you plenty of tools to kill large groups of enemies that weren't present in 2R. There are always conveniently placed explosive barrels, power generators, grenades, and loads of ammo. You're even given a cool new dodge move that protects you from incoming damage and auto-aims your weapon at the enemy's weak spot. You are definitely not too nerfed to deal with the situations you're placed in. But if the game is going to have such a large focus on running and gunning, then you need to overhaul the shooting mechanics and make it a more compelling shooter. There's no one way to do that, but maybe take a more RE4 route. Maybe headshots could lead to heavy staggers or criticals. Maybe shooting a zombie in the leg can drop them to their knees where they're now open to a melee or knife attack. Maybe the melee attack also pushes back the surrounding zombies and comes with loads of iframes that can be exploited to save yourself from an incoming zombie grab. Shooting certain spots on enemies could have consistent hit reactions so you can reliably strategize and execute plans if you're skilled enough. It would be satisfying to devise a general plan and then make snap decisions on what to do when you land or miss that crucial headshot. These are all suggestions taken directly from the combat of RE4, and these are all some of the aspects that make that game so endlessly replayable. But the shooting in 3R is very unsatisfying, partially because guns feel weak and partially because of how inconsistent hit reactions are. Enemies will react the same way to your shots no matter where you shoot them. Most of the time, shots won't even slow them down, and worst of all, you can't count on a headshot to stun enemies long enough to evade them. In fact, you can plug a zombie 3 times in the head and it won't even stun them. None of the nuances that give RE4 shooting such depth show up in 3R, which is a shame because with how good the graphics and art direction is in this game, adding tight shooting mechanics would have made blowing a zombie's head off very gratifying. That heavily criticized horde section that Carlos has could have been a heavily praised gauntlet akin to the opening village and the cabin sections in RE4. But instead of people talking about how much fun it was to gun down a horde of zombies, people are instead talking about how out of place that level was in 3R. The shooting was Capcom's one chance to inject a lot of tension into this game. It doesn't necessarily need to have 4's depth to be an engaging mechanic because like I said before, 2R shooting doesn't have that level of depth either, but the strict inventory management of 2R is what made the shooting engaging and adds a level of difficulty that elevates the horror of that game. 3R is far too easy of a game to be scary though. Inventory management in this game is nearly non-existent, which hamstrings the difficulty. Part of the satisfaction of the RE games is finding that careful balance of healing items, ammo, and key items you need to bring with you wherever you go. Bringing too many of one of those things necessarily means bringing less of another, and that's a fun little game of risk-reward you're required to play with yourself on every playthrough. But to put it simply, ammo and healing items aren't scarce enough. 3R dumps ammo on you, so much so that I wouldn't even use my knife to open boxes. I would leave my knife behind and just shoot the boxes open instead. And with an abundance of ammo, that trivializes enemy encounters because I can shoot and never worried that I'd run out. I never had to be careful with my ammo supply, and missing a shot meant nothing to me. There were even instances where I would pass on grabbing ammo because my inventory was so full, or I would have to dump it into my box to clear up space. Having so much firepower at my disposal also meant that it would be rare that I'd be grabbed by an enemy. Since taking damage was so infrequent, using healing items would be infrequent as well. I never hurt for a healing herb at any point, and I had a stockpile of them in my box. Herbs just aren't rare enough, but even having the number of herbs might not solve the issue when you're given a perfect dodge that has very generous timing and low cooldown. And executing a perfect dodge auto-aims your weapon at an enemy's weak point, further trivializing any threat you're put up against. Even Nemi can be dodged with ease. But hey, if you do mess up that dodge and get grabbed, you can just mash a button to minimize the amount of damage you'll take. I don't hate this game or even think it's a bad game. In fact, the reason why I felt compelled to make this video is that I think it's a good game that could have easily been a great game. And honestly, I hope RE3 gets another remake. Everyone in the RE community right now is talking about what game should be remade next. Should it be Code Veronica, Resident Evil 5, or possibly another remake of the first game and give it an over-the-shoulder perspective? I think Capcom's best move is to stop with the remakes and focus on original Resident Evil titles. But if they continue with the remakes, which I'm sure they will, my preference would be another Resident Evil 3 remake, or RE3R for short. I know it won't happen, but RE3 wasn't given the proper treatment here, and I'd be happy to buy another remake of it if it's done right. But this is the RE3R we have for now. If I wanted this to be a more well-rounded critique, I would spend a lot of time praising the incredible graphics, animations, and voice acting. I really believe that this game is a cut above the rest and sets a new standard for those aspects of video games. But bad pacing infects this game in so many areas, from the narrative structure to the level design, and even to the titular Nemesis. Cut content leaves this game feeling far too short. Shallow shooting mechanics makes the action dull and boring, and abusable dodges, alongside poor ammo and item balancing, saps this game of any difficulty and tension. Being a fan of the Resident Evil franchise means taking a lot of the bad with a little of the good. If you love the early survival horror games with the pre-rendered backgrounds, then you must also put up with the terrible writing, voice acting, and clunky controls. If you love the over-the-shoulder action-oriented games, then you must put up with excessive QTEs, overly bombastic stories, and all of RE6. And if you love the modernized survival horror post-RE7 era, then you must put up with, well, nearly all of that. Simply put, saying you're an RE fan usually follows up with explaining in detail which eras, which games, and all the caveats that go with them. Also, being a Resident Evil fan means you're trying your hardest to forget that any of the film adaptations exist.
I approached the first Resident Evil movie the same way I approached the first Mortal Kombat movie, which was as a fan. I had an in-depth knowledge of the games and what people really liked about them. Not the surface minutiae of what the characters are called and what they look like and what the storylines are. But I think I understood what people really got out of playing those games, what the enjoyment was.
Shut up, kid.
And I tried to kind of transfer that into the movie version. And I think that in-depth knowledge of the source material is key.
I'm gonna hit you.